Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the Comics Lair, an hour with Alex Simmons. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. The Comics Lair is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and the Heroes Convention. My guest today, Alex Simmons, is an award-winning freelance writer of plays, books, and comics, as well as a teaching artist, guest speaker, and creative consultant. He's written for Disney Books, Penguin Press, Simon & Schuster, DC Comics, and Archie Comics. Simmons is the creator of the acclaimed adventure comic book series Blackjack, and he's developed concepts and scripts for several animation projects. As a teaching artist, Simmons has developed and taught master classes and workshops for students and educators in the US, the West Indies, Africa, and Europe. He served on panels and delivered lectures on children's entertainment mediums, as well as empowering young people through the arts. Simmons founded the annual family event Kids Comic-Con and 3 comics art exhibits which have traveled abroad. He continues to develop and advocate for comics and creative arts programs for young people around the world. In 2017, Simmons won the Comic-Con International Inkpot Award for achievements in comic art. Welcome, Alex. It's good to have you.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Love what you've done with your background.
Oh, thank you. Canva. Love to play on Canva.
Yes, a little plug there for Canva. You know.
Yeah, they should pay us.
Yeah.
But since your career has primarily been as a writer, please tell us what got you started writing.
Pen and paper. Actually, I was and still am a big kid. But in my childhood, I loved stories. I loved storytelling. I loved everything about it. And of course, I grew up in the 50s, 60s. So I was a television kid, for one, but also I went to movies. I did read, but I read a lot of comic books more than regular books. But then I, would occasionally get into that. But I loved making up stories. I was an only child. And so, and not to say I was lonely, but I was alone a lot. And I had my action figures, and I would just create all kinds of adventures. And then eventually I started writing and drawing them, again, to whatever level or skill you want to say when you're 10 years old. And I think just thankfully I had a mother who didn't go, I was a waste of time and stop all this nonsense and your mind's wandering. She just, tried to make sure that I did my homework and my little chores around the house. But predominantly, she didn't squash my imagination. So with every 5 years or so, I would dabble a little bit further. And by the time I got out of high school, I was pursuing acting. And that was like the 1970s. And although we'd had the civil rights movement and then the blaxploitation films and then several prominent black stage plays, the roles for black men and women were still limited to either historical kind of scenarios where we're doing things about slavery or angry black men. And so I wanted to have more range as a writer and as an actor. So I started writing monologues and things to do for auditions that gave me more roles to play. And then I started writing plays, and slowly but surely I began to realize I enjoyed the writing and the creating of material and stories a little bit more than the performing. And so I became really more of a committed writer at that point. That's a capsule version of the story.
Well, when we were talking before we started recording, you mentioned Ray Bradbury as an influence. Will you tell us about that?
Yes. I think I was probably in middle school, what we call junior high at that time. So 14, 15 years of age. And I read Something Wicked This Way Comes. And the Seller of Lightning Rods is part of the opening line. And just the way he phrased the wording, the imagery that came to my mind. As I said, I've been dabbling and doing this sort of thing as a writer, but I read that story and it sort of stuck with me. And then a few years later in my 20s, I read it again and I went, okay, that's it. That's the way. I want to be able to tell stories like that. I want to be able to write like that. And it just sort of catapulted me into the pursuit of that. And then to make, the universe, to show how the universe can work. I think I was in my 30s and I had already written some plays and I'd written comic books, and one of them was a character I created called Blackjack, which is an African-American soldier of fortune in the 1930s. And so those books had been coming out, and I was at a comic convention in San Diego, or It was in California. I don't think it was San Diego, but I was at a Comic-Con, and I'm in a cafeteria area, and I see this large man in a electric blue shirt, button-up shirt, white suspenders, and white Bermuda shorts being wheeled into the commissary area, and I realized it was Ray Bradbury. And he was there to give a speech, a presentation, but they were giving him a chance to have something to eat. And I, as I said, I was inspired to finally pursue writing because of him. So I thought, here's my opportunity to thank him. And I'm just trying to think, how can I get over there to thank him? I don't want to interrupt anything. So the two people who were looking after him, one of them sort of broke off to check out something. So I went to speak to him first, and I explained, the whole thing. I wanted to just thank him. And he says, well, I don't know, Dorothy, that was the young lady who was still tending to Ray. She's very strict about people not talking to him and everything. And so meanwhile, while he's telling me this, it's going to be hard. Maybe it's not going to happen. Dorothy, this young lady, sort of circles us. I guess trying to get a feeling, why is her assistant talking to me? And then finally she stops just to my left and she's looking at me. And the young assistant goes, look, Alex, let me do this. Says, Dorothy, this is Alex Simmons. And he would like, she says, oh, I know Alex Simmons. And I'm thinking, okay, I don't remember her. This could be embarrassing. What do I say? And she continues. She says, Alex, when a couple of years ago, you wrote a series of articles about how to create comics that were printed in Wizard magazine. And I read those articles and I was writing back and forth to you and you were answering me. And I'm thinking, oh, okay. Fine. Great. That's wonderful. So he says, he'd like to speak to Ray. She goes, oh, for Alex, no problem. And so in effect, Ray inspired me to write. And because I became a writer, what I wrote touched somebody else who then made it possible for me to meet and thank Ray.
That is so cool.
Yeah, the universe is weird. It's fun like that. So that's also why my life is still amusing. I have stories like that.
Well, you also have an extensive career in popular culture, comics, and the arts with a wide array of projects. What was your first professional job?
Ooh, wow. If I remember right, it's because, as I said to you just before the show, I have to sometimes reread my resume. The very, very first professional job that I recall was writing some articles for Cadence magazine, which actually used to be the owner of Marvel Comics. So they were putting out a music magazine at the time, some sort of pop culture thing. And because I had connections with musicians and things like that, I had the opportunity to go interview some musicians, including some jazz musicians and Melba Moore, who was a very popular vocalist at the time. And I was writing articles, doing interviews and writing the articles for that. So that was where it started. And then at a certain point, my friend Don McGregor, who I'd met at a Comic-Con, and Don had lived in Rhode Island, and by this point, now a couple of years later, had moved to New York City and was working for Marvel as an editor and in-house writer. Don and I started talking, and I got to go up to Marvel a lot, meet these guys, and I pitched some stuff that didn't fly, but I did wind up eventually getting to pitch something to DC, and I then got to pitch something to Eclipse, which was an independent publishing house. And so the articles were first, and then there was the pitching of a couple of things. I finally got one or two stories picked up, and then I wrote a play. I wrote a Sherlock Holmes play, and that was really sort of the breakout for me, because that play received an off-Broadway production and got some good reviews, and things started to happen from there.
And so one of the things that happened was your creation of the original comic book character, Blackjack. You mentioned him just a few minutes ago. Would you please tell everyone a little bit more about him and how you came into that project?
Well, yes, I have show and tell here. I have pictures. So this is I don't want to get the light shining on it. Here, I'll do it this way. There we go. Okay. So this is one of the anthologies. Blackjack is an African-American soldier of fortune in the 1930s, as I said earlier. And also, as I mentioned earlier, in the 70s, there was, we'd just gone through the civil rights movement quite a bit. We had certain changes in media in terms of television and film, in terms of more appearances of Black actors, Black characters. But we were still sort of playing a ping pong game of types. You were a street type, or occasionally you were a teacher or something that was considered more upright, or you were doing the plantation stories. And because I knew that there was a wide berth of roles that African Americans and people of color had played in the history of the world, I was, very inspired to try and tell those stories in some way. And one of the things I tend to say to my writing students is, speak when you're writing, speak from your heart, speak from your passion, speak from what you know as much as you can. And as a kid growing up in the 50s, 60s, and not seeing a lot of those representations, my heroes in television and film were usually white actors and white characters, but they were cowboys who did the right thing. They were adventurers and explorers who did the right thing, who traveled the globe in different time periods and things like that. So as a kid, you want to have those adventures. You want to see yourself as a globe-trotting adventurer or a Western hero or whatever. So that was in there too. And so what I did was I looked at Black history in terms of what we were actually doing in the 1800s, the early 1900s, and so forth, and slowly began to say, yes, there could have been an adventurer who did these things. It's legitimate. I can justify that, and I can also do it as a total fictional experience. And so I created Aaron Day. His nom de plume, his adventurer's name is Blackjack, but his actual name is Aaron Day. And I created a family, because that was another thing that was usually missing in stories about Black characters. Usually you're raised by a single parent, if any parents at all. And so he had a mother and a father, and his father had been a mercenary before him. Long story, but I won't go into that now. But because his father had been that, and because the family had the opportunity to travel the world a little bit more, Aaron wanted to be like his father when he grew up. And so I was reflecting some of my own life experiences. I was also reflecting some of Black history. And then again, because of my years of watching these movies and these TV series and noting that representation of people of different cultures and colors were usually stereotypical, I wanted to try not to do that. So my first story that was published, which was Second Hand of the Cobra, Blackjack goes up against a rebel leader who is in the Middle East, but I tried to tell the story of why this character had risen against the British at one point, and then what turned him sour and eventually brought the adventure to where he and Aaron had to encounter each other and deal with it. And I tried to be more respectful of the culture and the characters as best I could. So that's been my theme with the Blackjack series for a long time. And because of that, and some of the, some of the other books, like this one, this is a graphic novel. Again, I got to try and hold it so that there we go. This is The Second Bite of the Cobra, which was the first storyline that was published. And this is a cover by Scott Hanna, an artist that's rather well known. And this was the first one. And then this was the second graphic novel. And again, I got to try and hold it. So, there we go. And this is Blood and Honor. So as one story takes place in the Middle East, this one takes place in Japan and China. I also, once again, tried to represent historical fact while having fun with this adventure in historical fiction and justifiably putting a Black character in there. Because I was doing this in the late 70s, I was doing this in the 90s by this point. Blackjack first came out in 1996. So because I was doing it in the 90s and there wasn't a lot of that going on at that time, it got a lot of attention. And that led me to being approached by Joe Ilyich, who was at that time an associate editor at DC Comics, working with the great Denny O'Neil. And that they brought me in and we had a discussion, and I was able to do a Batman miniseries called Batman Orpheus Rising. And I also was also able to do a DC Scooby Doo and a Superman story. I thought I'll just stop talking for a moment there.
But all that grew out of your work on Blackjack.
90% of it, was made possible because of my work on Blackjack.
Well, and speaking of your work on Blackjack, who is Mary Day?
You really did some reading there. As I said before, when I created the character, one of the things that was normally missing from stories about Blacks or African Americans was family. A good deal of the time we were solo or, orphans or whatever. So Aaron Day's family, it consists of his mother and father and his older sister, Mary. Mary is a year and a few months older than him. And when I was creating the character of Blackjack, I saw the family. I saw his father and the justification of his father leaving the United States to go fight overseas, like with Theodore Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, things like that, because World War I, a number of Black soldiers went over to Europe and fought and found themselves away from the United States in the segregationist attitudes that they were living with, they'd grown up with. They didn't find it in the same dimensions in these other countries. And so many of them didn't want to come back here. And so to me, Aaron's father, Matthew, was one of those characters. He could, and this was a phrase that was used, feel more like a man, because he was able to fight and do things that were more considered manly and feel more proud of himself than coming back here and being a porter or shoe shine or whatever. So Aaron's mother was left to take care of the two children, and the father would send money back to them. And so Mary Day and Aaron, for a while, formed this sort of this team. They sort of faced the everyday life together. They went to school together. They dealt with neighborhood bullies together. They felt, very connected. And then when they went overseas to travel with their father and their mother, while the dad was off fighting in some battle miles and miles away, mom was trying to introduce Mary and Aaron to whatever culture they were living in or around at that time. So both of them grew up a little bit more worldly wise. And at a certain point, because tragedy has to strike in order for many great heroes to step forward, their parents are killed at some point when Mary's about 16 and Aaron's 15. And they stayed in Europe living with friends of the family for about 5 years, and then they came back to the United States. And Aaron had already decided, I'm going to follow in my father's footsteps. I'm going to be a soldier of fortune. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to do these things. And I'm going to, sort of stake my claim to the world and show that I'm a man. All right. Mary's going, that's nice. That's really nice, Aaron. I'm not doing that. I'm going to get a home somewhere in the country. I want to have more of a normal life. You, my brother, we are family. I used to kick your butt when you were smaller. I still can. So you don't forget that. Whenever you want to come home, you've got a place to come to. But I'm going to go and set up a more normalized life. And I have to say that in the 90s, when I was doing this, when I was creating this story and envisioning all these changes, I couldn't really figure out why I was having a rather worldly aware young Black woman choose to come back to segregated US of A and go live in the South. It was like, why am I doing that? I couldn't figure out why. But as a writer, sometimes, your characters talk to you. She's saying, no, that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm supposed to do. And I'm going, why? And it's no answer. So I did. And for a number of the stories that I did about Blackjack, every now and then I would bring up Mary, or she'd write to him, or he'd have some sort of communication with her. And I still, for a good many years, had no idea, why do I have her in the South? Then recently, in 2000, and I'm reaching for, I had a copy of it here, and I don't see it right now, but I do have a copy of the book, and I'll find it later. But in 2019, I decided to finally write some of the short stories about the character that I wanted to, and I'd been putting off for the longest time. And while writing one of them, because of the circumstances I put her in, it suddenly became very clear to me why she was there. And I was teasing somebody the other day about not telling them why, but I will tell you. Um, the line that came out of that was that Aaron's battlefield is global, whereas Mary's battles are on the home front. And so she's in a position with the knowledge and the skills that she has, she's in a position to go up against certain adversarial circumstances that befall Black people at that time with the intelligence and also at times with the fighting skills necessary to better deal with it, to take steps that many Blacks would not have at that time. So I have one who travels the globe doing that. I have another one in the United States who does that. And I was very excited I was very happy with the 3 stories that I did put it together in the anthology, The Day Chronicles. And that's also available on Amazon.
Right. Well, this is way back in the rearview mirror at this point. But you participated in the 9/11 comic book projects, the 2 volumes to commemorate the events and the first responders of 9/11. And you worked on the Dark Horse volume, didn't you?
Actually, it was the DC.
The DC volume.
Yes, Paul Levitz.
Could you tell everybody how that came about and what that book was? Because I imagine there are people watching this who weren't alive or weren't reading at the time all this happened.
Yeah. Paul Levitz is one of those people who worked his way up the ladder. And I believe the story, I didn't know him when he first started with DC, but I believe the story was that he started out working the mailroom or something like that, grunt work in editorial something, and eventually became president of DC Comics. And so I met him when he was the president of DC Comics, and it was in the early days of my dabbling in comics. And for whatever reason, I mean, he was a decent enough guy and we just got along. So we would have these little conversations every now and then. And he was aware that I had written Blackjack. He was aware that I had written some other things for DC. And 9/11 came. And I remember 2 things about that time. There were many things to remember, but 2 things in particular regarding Paul. One of them was that for the days after, immediately after 9/11, when I had stopped off at the DC building, Paul would leave his office and go floor to floor, checking on the employees who had come in to see how they were doing. And if any of them just, because it was a highly intensely emotional time, if any of them were just, they just shouldn't be there. They should be home with their families or home just taking care of themselves. He would send them home. And he walked the halls to make sure that people were okay in that respect. So that's one thing I remember about him. The other thing was that he contacted me completely out of the blue and said that they were putting together this book, this anthology, and that different writers and artists were going to be contributing material to this book. And would I be willing to do something like that? And I'm thinking, like, you had to ask, and of course, you have, as a writer, as a creative, you have the challenge of what can I do that's going to be as good, hopefully, as everybody else's contribution, but also different. And I did come up with a story, and it was a little bit sort of, I guess, on a spiritual level. But I remember looking at what had happened, and for those of you who weren't around when 9/11 hit, to my knowledge, and I'm not a historian, but to my knowledge, the United States had never experienced a terrorist attack of that magnitude to where 3,000 lives were lost in one shot. And so we were staggered in a lot of ways. And so what I tried to do was look back at history when we had been hit by traumatic experiences and what kind of great people, not just in the United States, but what kind of great people had seen society through or seen their people through in those difficult times. And I tried to put a little piece together that reflected that and would maybe add at towards the end a little note of we'll make it, we'll be okay. It's going to hurt for a while. It's going to take some time, but we'll be okay. And that was sort of the story that I tried to do. And Paul was the editor on the book, and except for a couple of tweaks, he liked it, and it made it in there. And I'm literally forever proud that I was a part of that particular experience, and thankful to Paul for that opportunity.
Well, that project and Batman and Blackjack would seem to be very different in tone from the work that you've done on Scooby-Doo and the Archie crew. So,
or Tarzan.
So when you do these different types of projects as a writer, do you have to reach for a particular mindset for each project, or does everything start in the same way and then branch off into its particular tone?
I like to think of my writing choices and efforts the same way I used to think of my acting experiences taking on different characters. I try to get into the mindset and the energy of the particular project I'm working on. It's very different to write The Dark Knight than to write a cartoon dog. You know, somebody said, well, how can you do that? How can you write Scooby-Doo when you've done such, you get to work on Batman. That's what I said. Every project that I work on, it's the same thing. I want to do my best. I want to have a good time with it. I want to deliver to the audiences. So there's no difference. Batman, Scooby-Doo, Sherlock Holmes, that approach is always going to be the same. And secondly, as a writer, you want to tell a story that's going to feel authentic in whatever tone and world it exists. So yeah, you do try and get your mind wrapped around that world. So for instance, the first Scooby-Doo story that I did, I set it in Seattle, Washington, because I had been there, and I knew that there was an underground tour in a certain area of Seattle, because at one time there'd been a big fire, and after the destruction and everything, they built up the streets in that part of the area again, but they built it one level up. So what had been the ground floor or the main street level was now the basement, in effect, and you could tour that area. So I thought, what a great creepy place to have a Scooby-Doo story. So, I pulled from my own personal experience and awareness, whereas there's one of the Scooby stories that they published 2 or 3 times. As a matter of fact, it was every year at Christmas time, and it's a Wonderful Fright is the name of the story, and it's an homage, a hat off to It's a Wonderful Life, the Jimmy Stewart film, and that was me thinking about this film that I had always enjoyed and watched almost every Christmas when I was growing up. And here was my chance to play with that and the Scooby Gang. But once again, it's the formula to Scooby. And how do I do that? How do I separate Shaggy and Scooby from the rest of the team? And then I went, oh, that's how, because her personality would be this, and Fred's personality would be this, so he would be this. And so once again, you have to get into the mindset of the characters just enough to know how you want to shift things or present things or reflect things in order to hopefully, get the story to work for everybody. So yeah, I definitely do that. I sort of submerge myself in that world. When I did Tarzan, I did the same thing. And I remember at the 100th anniversary of Tarzan, and I was in San Diego at a Comic-Con at that point, and someone said, how can you, a black man, write Tarzan? And I said, well, usually with a pen and paper or, my laptop. And, there was a bit of chuckling and everything. I said, no, I mean, seriously. I said, I know exactly what you mean. And no, I won't write him or it the same way Edgar Rice Burroughs did, or a white writer would, per se, because I have more at stake in a certain way. But at the same time, I recognize the power of the iconic character. I can be true to that world, but how I'm going to tell the story and maybe how I'm going to represent the Africans in the story, I might come at it totally from a different place of respect. So ultimately, yeah, you sort of embrace the world that you're going to work in, And if you want, you can come up with new angles and a new perspective and something fun and exciting that you can try, or you can give the same old, whichever is your call. But you do want to do your homework.
Well, what was the most fun about writing Tarzan for you?
Two things, and two different stories. I was writing the Tarzan Sunday strips for United Feature Syndication under the guiding hand of editor Amy Lago at that time. And the very first series, and you do comic strips, and you do a story over a certain period of weeks. So the very first story that I did was a group of African boys living in this particular village wanted to prove that they were men. They wanted to somehow prove that they were men and do this rites of passage, but they're too young to do the one where they theoretically would go out there and face down a lion. So they figured we could do this with Tarzan. You know, if we can best Tarzan, we'll prove to our parents and everybody in the village that we're men. We're ready to be men. And so that was fun to me because it was just kids trying to do something wacky, silly, and a little bit dangerous with an adult character who would understand, who was very powerful and everything, but also would understand. And so I had fun with that kind of take on the storyline. The other experience that was really a lot of fun and ratcheted up a notch was Amy gave me a chance to do a crossover between Tarzan and my character, Blackjack. And when she first made the offer, Eric Battle was the artist that I was working on the series with. And so Eric and myself and Amy Lago were sitting having lunch and talking about the next project. And she said, you know, would you think we could do a crossover between, you know, Tarzan and Blackjack? And I thought she was kidding. And then when I realized she was serious, I went, well, yeah. And I thought business, but of course I would still maintain ownership of my character. And she said, of course. And believe me, Edgar Rice Burroughs is going to own Tarzan. So once that was clear that nobody was going to own anything other than what was theirs, the next challenge was that the Tarzan strip that we were doing was present day, and Blackjack is 1930s. And so what am I going to do here? And I had to come up with a way of doing the story where they could actually meet, which was fun. And it was a challenge, but it was a lot of fun. And Eric turned out some great artwork on it, which the only place you can see it, I think, is online. And I don't have the link, but maybe by the time you post this, I can make the link available. But Eric did some great artwork. It was a great adventure. I had a great time doing it. And to this day, it's one of the things that I'm really proud of.
Well, it sounds like you had a great time doing it too. And so while we're talking about having a great time doing things, Batman is kind of the 5,000-pound elephant in every room in the comic moment. So what was the most fun or the most challenging to you about writing Batman?
I guess the most challenging was coming up with the story that I would do, because I was literally asked to create a Black character for the Batman world, Batman universe, in particular, a Black hero. And that's different from saying, would you like to do a Batman story? You know? Mm-hmm. So part of it was, okay, what does that mean? You know, what are you thinking when you say, you know, editors, when you ask for a Black character, a Black hero? And then what am I thinking? And can we meet on the same plane? And once again, like with, you know, some of the Black characters in comics, there were certain roles or stereotypes that were presented around that time and just prior. So, you know, again, ex-con, or school teacher or social worker, difficult life, no parents, one parent. And so I, once again, wanted to go against type. And I wanted to create a character who came from, once again, two-parent family. And no, they weren't domestics. They were professionals. Because, again, I knew these existed. And so I created this character. So creating the character was the most challenging, coming up with the hero who was eventually called called Orpheus, and also coming up with what is his abilities. He wasn't going to be super powered, and I wanted him to come from a science basis. So it was. I finally decided on the technology of vibrations and sound, and then I was thinking, well, what can I do with that? And what can I do with creating his background, and how does his background tie into his abilities? And by the time I put all that together, I was very excited and happy about it. And then Dwayne Turner was the illustrator, and he designed wonderful costumes for the characters. This was too cool, because writing Batman per se was not the challenge, the bigger challenge. I'd grown up reading Batman. It was one of my favorite, superheroes, because he wasn't super powered. And I even, would tell people, and I still do, that as a kid, you want to grow up to be Batman. You want to have all these abilities and everything. And then there was a certain point where I was in my 20s, and I went, gee, I'm supposed to be Batman by now. I'm supposed to have worked out and been that strong. And of course, I wasn't a scientific genius in school, so okay, I'm going to miss out on that. But maybe I could still, if I work out, I could still, get that body together. That didn't happen. And then a few years go by, and then suddenly I realized, because now I'm married with children, I'm going, oh, I'm the parent that gets killed so that my kid can become Batman. Okay, missed that boat. But I knew the character so well and had so many ideas about stories for him that once I had my new hero created, I knew exactly how I wanted them to interact, where things would go south in certain ways, and what would be learned by each character about the other, and hopefully turn in a good series. It was a mini series with 6 issues or 5 issues. And I, again, hope that the story worked out. Over the years, I've been told by various fans that it did work. So I was pleased with it. Denny O'Neil was the editor I started with, but he left about midway through, and so I finished up with another editor. But either way, I was happy that I had that opportunity. And again, the challenge was creating a Black hero that I felt would be a good, solid addition to the Batman universe. I can honestly say, despite how he was treated after I finished the story, and I think it was within a year, he was unceremoniously eliminated. I am still pleased with the work that Dwayne and I did with that book.
Well, you also worked on another famous Black hero. You contributed to the Tales of Wakanda anthology.
Yes.
And so could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, and I can get that one in there too. There we go. Yes. This, I owe the opportunity to work on this to one, Jesse Holland. Jesse Holland, who's he's a great writer. He's a journalist. He's a professor. Just so many things. He's such a talented human being. And again, I guess if anybody wants to look at my life, it's a series of remarkable luck and treating people, hopefully, the right way, making friends with people without assumptions. Because Jesse I met, and he tells his story, so I'll do this very quickly. Jesse I met years before at a Harlem book fair. And I was there with, my comics and things, some other things that I had done. And he was a writer. I didn't even know him. He was just a writer sitting at a table with his books. I think it was one of his first books out. And I went by and I was looking, and I got to talking to him. And he says, as he puts it, I said some words of encouragement that really had an impact. Oh, great. I was speaking from the heart, so I'm glad to know that. 2019, I'm in Atlanta at a Comic-Con with Don McGregor, and Jesse comes there, and we're talking, and I hadn't seen him in years. And he says, I'm working on this anthology about the Black Panther, and I would really love it if you could pitch an idea for the book. And I thought, you're kidding. I said, no. I said, oh, that would be great. He says, now Marvel's part of this, and and I don't know what we're doing, but I would really love it if you could be a part of this. So I thanked him again. A couple of weeks later, or a few weeks later, I sent him a pitch for a story. No guarantees it's gonna fly. He liked it. Made some suggestions. I reworked it. took the pitch back, sent it into Marvel, and then I didn't hear anything for a few months. And then I finally got the word that, yep, it was accepted. And so this was great. So I am one of 18 authors in this book, 18 writers, including one person that I've known off and on for years, Nikki Giovanni, the poetess Nikki Giovanni. So this is just it was such a great experience. And it was the second time that I've had anything to do with writing material for or about the Black Panther.
Well, what was the other time?
Travis Langley, Dr. Travis Langley, about 2 years prior to this opportunity, approached me to be a co-editor and to contribute a piece of writing to the Black Panther psychology book. And that was a great one. So I not only had an opportunity to co-edit the book with him, but it was a type of an anthology. It was a series of essays by a number of psychologists, psychiatrists, some comic book aficionados, their own particular impressions and deductions and viewpoints about the power and the attraction and the relevance of the Black Panther and Wakanda in the world. And so I also was able to interview one of the original voiceover actors who had done the first Black Panther animated appearance, and had that piece in the book as well. So this has just been, it's been a remarkable few years of just these wonderful opportunities with Batman, with Black Panther, with Scooby, with Tarzan, with Batman, with all of these characters that I grew up with and have now had an opportunity to add to that canon.
Well, speaking of characters people grow up with, you've actually also worked in the Mouse Kingdom. Would you please tell us what you've done for Disney?
Yes, the world of Disney. Yes, I worked for what was called a book packager. This is back in the 80s and 90s. I worked for it was called Mega Books, and a book packager. Just to quickly explain to people, it's like being a TV producer for the network. Your job is to put together these books, stories, get writers on the job, and all that kind of stuff, so that the publishers or the producers have something to put out into the world and content. So this particular book packager had been approached by Grolier Books for Disney to do a series of books based on Disney films. There was Aladdin, there was Pocahontas, and there was The Lion King. And I, in working for him, had the opportunity to work on all of those books. So for Aladdin, I was able to write one particular story for the, I think it was a series of 5 books. I was able to write one of the books. And for Pocahontas, I was the co-editor on the series of 5 books. And I was also able to write one of the stories, which there's a certain amount of controversy around that. I'll tell you about that in a moment. And then for The Lion King, I was able to actually plot out the 5 stories. And then I was able to write one of the books as well. And that one was called A Tale of Two Brothers. And it's how Scar got his scar when they were younger. And, it's just, again, being able to get into the character's head and say, okay, so if this is how you were in the movie, what did you do that brought that on, and take that back? And I had fun with that as well.
Even the villain is the hero of his own story.
Yeah, well, every character has a story. I mean, how they got to where they are, good or bad, there's a tale to be told, and it's just whether or not you decide to tell it. With Pocahontas, one of the interesting things about that was that my story takes place before the settlers arrive. And so in doing my research, I found out it was the settlers that named the chief Powhatan, because the names of the Algonquin people, many of them reminded me a little bit of the Aztec names. They have, it's just almost unpronounceable by most of us. So I said, well, we can't, it's a kid's book too, so the kids aren't going to be able to read and pronounce these names. And since the settlers were the ones who called him Powhatan. I can't really use that. So I would have the people in the story, his fellow tribesmen, would call him the Great Chief, which was actually part of the way they honored him. Well, I turned in my story and I got, some flack back about, no, he's got to be called Powhatan because that's his name. I said, yeah, but it's the name that the settlers gave him. He says, no, he's called. I said, yeah, but, and basically the debate came down to, we wanted authentic. And I'm saying this is authentic. Yeah, but it's not authentic in the way that we presented it in the movie. I said, oh, okay, well, then we have a problem. And then there was something else about some of the words. Again, the Algonquin language is a dead language, but some of the words and things I either couldn't translate, had no way of knowing what they meant, or words that I would substitute seemed appropriate for the story, but would not offend their language. But then the editor wanted me to do some things where I took some of their words and dropped a vowel or two here and just pretended it meant such. I said, I can't do that. That's dishonoring of people's language and culture. And again, they said, well, no, we can do this. And I said, well, I tell you what, then you take my name off of the story. Because, you own the story, fine. Just don't put my name on it. And they said, excuse me? And I said, no harm, no foul. Just take my name off of it and you can do whatever you want to do with it. And the response was, and this person wasn't being mean, but they seemed a little incredulous. They said, but this is a Disney book. And I said, yes, I know. And believe me, I love the opportunity to do the work, but I can't be a part of that. So just take my name off of the story. And there was a beat pause, and I'm fully prepared for them to go, well, go fly a kite, fella. And instead she says, well, if you were to do some more research and all that, how much time would you need? And I said, probably about another week or two. And there was another beat pause, and they said, okay, you have it. And I was thunderstruck, because this was not a power play for me. It was like, hey, So I got the 2 weeks. I managed to do the additional work in the Native American Museum and a couple of people that I knew who were of the Native American heritage, and was able to work out something they felt would be respectful. And I turned that in, and Disney went with it.
Very cool.
Life is interesting at times, very interesting.
Yeah, sometimes things come around in odd ways.
I also think, yes, you're right. And I also think that sometimes good people just need a chance to show, yeah, I'm a good person. Yeah, we'll make this work.
Well, and also when people are accustomed to doing things a certain way, sometimes it's not necessarily easy for them to step out of the familiar path and go in a somewhat different direction. Exactly.
Yeah, you're right. Certainly, as I said, it was a shock, but I'm happy it worked out the way it did.
That's great. And speaking of different directions, you've not only done numerous types of fiction projects, including comic books, but you've also worked on nonfiction. Would you tell everybody about some of those projects?
Yes. Well, one of them is, Mysteries of the Past, which was a book, was a collection of real mysteries, like Easter Island, how did the carvings get made, and the Mary Celeste, the ship that was found abandoned with the cooking ware and everything still active in their place, and no lifeboats. I think it was one lifeboat missing, but originally you heard the story, there were no lifeboats missing, yet all the crew and everybody was gone. There was the village in Virginia of settlers that disappeared. So it was a collection of those types of authentic historical mysteries, unsolved, that I did some writing on that, and that was fun. There were a couple of other projects that I did, and I also have done a book called The Art of Making Comics, which is nonfiction, and it's really a nice, simple A to Z of how to create your own comics, either comic strips or comic books, from idea to finished published property, either in hard copy or online. So those are two of the things. And then I did 3 biographies, one of Denzel Washington, John Lucas, who was a famous basketball player and coach, of a national basketball team, and of Dr. Benjamin Carson, not the politician Carson, but when Dr. Carson was purely a doctor and had performed, actually had, I forget the exact term for this, had developed the procedure for brain operation that separated two children who were conjoined at the brain and skull. And he developed that surgery and performed that surgery. I got to actually interview him and do his biography, again, for young people. But it was remarkable to talk to him and hear about his life and the trials and tribulations he went through to become a doctor, let alone to, at that point in his life, become a brilliant surgeon and the youngest man to head up John Hopkins neurosurgery, and I think the first Black man to do that. And of course, everybody knows who Denzel Washington is. You know? So those are some of the nonfiction books that I've had an opportunity to work on over the years.
So you've done a lot of work with action adventure and a lot of work with history.
Yep.
So what's the draw of history for you?
Considering that I really bit at that in school, you know, I do find it kind of interesting that that's how I fell into it. I you know, first and foremost, I believe very strongly that we as a people, and I mean human beings, it's almost like we have the memory of ants after hibernation. It's like we forget stuff happened before we got here. Our civilizations and people of different backgrounds, cultures, genders, or whatever have gone through hell and back 1,000 times over before we got here. And we could learn from some of that, but it seems too much trouble. And so it's almost like we try to act as if, no, nothing had happened before I got here, and now I can do all this. And then we make a lot of the same mistakes over and over again. So one of the things that began to fascinate me, and I think it started with really the African-American experience, was I knew Blacks had been explorers and soldiers and scientists and inventors. And yet, for the first 12 years of my life, I didn't hear anything about that. For the next 5 years, you only heard about the standards, like, you know, George Washington Carver and things like that, you know. And then you start to learn about Matthew Perry and all these other people, going, Mike, how much is not known? So once that sort of shifted into my thinking, it became, we can't afford to, and when I say we, I mean not only Black people, but people can't afford to forget that certain things were accomplished, that certain people did remarkable things, that women did remarkable things beyond and much greater than any stereotype will ever represent or shoot down. And so that we need to be reminded of that. And I knew that as a kid, I didn't want to study history. You know, what was the point? Come on, that was then. This is now. So I realized that in order to make it more palatable and attractive, you had to couch it in something that was stimulating and exciting for people. And so for me, it was, well, you always wanted to be an adventurer and explore the world during that time when we were a bit more naive about this and that. How about taking the probability that a Black character might have done this and that, or did do this and that, and go from there? That, I feel, was my first real introduction to looking at history and looking at action adventure and looking at storytelling and melding them together. And after that, it just seemed to become a thread that was always woven into almost everything else that I did. It was important to me to acknowledge certain things and certain people that had been in my life and that had come before I was. So, okay, let me look back, and certain incidents and even look at certain historically recorded events and correct misconceptions. You know, people say that to the victor goes the spoils, but also the victor gets to write history. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they're not accurate. And so once again, I try and find ways to tell entertaining, exciting stories or meaningful stories that anybody can enjoy, but I also try and get us to take a look at a particular point or a particular character because he, she, or they might have something to share that would be useful to us going forward.
Well, in addition to being a writer, you're also an arts educator. And I found an interesting reference on your website. So would you tell us what the color of comics is?
Yeah, you really did your homework. Okay. The color of comics. Once again, being African American and or being a person of color, period, and growing up in New York City, which is a great place to grow up because if you're fortunate and if you're aware, you get to meet people from so many different backgrounds and cultures and countries. That I was aware that there was a lot of artworks and comics that had been done by people who were not Caucasian. But like Brian Stelfreeze or certain other people, unless something in your name said you were Chinese, black, or Japanese, or whatever, Hispanic, a lot of people didn't know about that. So that was one. Two, there was not, when I was coming up, a lot of representation of people of color, except maybe in the Western comics, you had Indians, Native Americans. And then in certain comics like Black Hawk or things like that, you might see Chinese or Japanese. And other than that, nothing. And even then, as Larry Hama speaks, there was a period of time where all Chinese and Japanese characters in comics were colored yellow, as opposed to just some sort of lighter hued complexion. So I wanted to show that comics at the point that I started that exhibit, which was in the 90s, that there was more diversity now and that we needed to acknowledge it was there in order to have more of it, because it was a matter of a lot of people were complaining that there wasn't any. And I'm saying that's not quite accurate. There is some, but there needs to be more. So let's acknowledge what's been done and let's build on that. So I put together this exhibition, mostly digital at first, prints, because we couldn't get everybody's original art. But it was an exhibit that was held at Bronx Community College in their art gallery. And we had prints and blow-ups of pages from comic art, as well as a few pieces of original art there. And I remember two things in particular. When the exhibit was being hung, there was a Hispanic young man who was a college student who was helping hang the artwork in the gallery. And he noticed the name Fernando Ruiz on the cover of an Archie comic that he was hanging. And he went, "There are Hispanics in comics?" And I said, "Yeah." And so when the exhibit opened, and then when we did the Kids Comic Con a few months after that, I made sure that that young man was introduced to some of the Spanish artists in the business, both established and up and coming. Because here he is, a college student studying graphic design in a college with other Latinos around him, but he did not know that there had already been some in the business. So that was an exhibit that was up at that time. And then we did a digital form of it online. And then in 2010, we were given an opportunity with the Kids Comic Con to go to Senegal, Africa, with a mobile version of the exhibition. And so we held it there for about 10 days in the city of Dakar. And we did workshops with the kids in the school system there. And we had a conference at the University of Dakar. And even as I say this, I get chills because it was so darn exciting. It was just really just a great time.
Well, you just referred to Kids Comic Con. What is that?
I obviously haven't, my brain doesn't stop. I think when I'm asleep, I might rest. I'm not sure. Again, back in the late 90s, 1995 through 99 or something like that, you go to a lot of comic conventions, things like that, and comics were at one point for everybody. But then in the 90s, the latter part of the 90s, the comics started to get more severe, more intense, a lot of violence, a lot of gore, a lot of sexual content, a lot of cursing. They call it more adult. I know a lot of adults don't need all of that. I mean, it's a part of the life, and I get that. But the comic book business seemed to just be swinging heavily in that direction. cutting kids out of it totally. Just even at the conventions, we had a lot of extreme, intense material on the tables. We had a number of scantily clad young ladies, and I happen to like scantily clad young ladies, but you had them selling, I like this word, salacious material, right next to a table with Scooby-Doo or Felix the Cat. So I said, there needs to be some way, like a section, like, there's a kids section, or there's an double X adult section or something at the conventions, because the kids really shouldn't be exposed to some of this material. And that wasn't happening. So I finally decided that maybe if I could do an event that showed that family and kids would populate such an event, and therefore having an area for them at the regular cons would make it worthwhile to the promoters, maybe then, that could happen. So I created this thing with Eugene Adams, who's the director of educational outreach at Bronx Community College. He said, if you were going to do a Comic-Con, how would you do it here? And I said, well, I just call a few friends of mine and get a couple of artists and things like that. And we'll just have it like maybe in the lunchroom or something here on the campus, and keep it simple. Maybe I can get like 10 of my friends to show up as artists, and maybe we'll get like 50 people from the community, and they'll come, and it'll just sort of show that family and kids matter. Okay. So he made it possible for me to use the facility there, and we were getting some posters printed up and everything. And I happened to mention this to Calvin Reed, who is a major editor with Publishers Weekly. And he said, I heard something about this. This is yours? I said, yeah. He said, well, tell me more about it. So I told him about it. So the next thing I know, there's a blurb that goes out about it. This is like 2 weeks before the event. Suddenly, the phone and the emails are ringing off the hook with people who wanted to be a part of this. And so to make an extremely long story short, instead of 10 professionals there, we had 45 artists, publishers, and various participants who had tables at this event. And I believe the audience, because we didn't keep accurate count, but I believe we had a turnout of somewhere between 700 and almost 1,000 people come to the campus of Bronx Community College. Now, you please understand, Bronx Community College, to get there, you have to take, if you're coming by bus, you have to take 2 or 3 buses to then get to the street where the campus begins, to then walk onto the campus. That's about a 2-block walk. If you come by train, you have to get off on Jerome Avenue in the Bronx and then walk up a hill about 7 blocks to then get to the campus and then walk another 2 blocks. So we were not conveniently located anywhere, but we had either people drive there, bus loads of people. We even came across 2 librarians who flew in from Chicago to attend this thing. And it was mind-boggling what happened. And at the end of it, when the last patron was out the door and I closed the door and I'm standing there still trying to take in what had happened, I turn around and I'm looking at the publishers and the comic artists and everything at their tables, and some of them are dancing. They are so charged because they finally got to see kids actually thrilled, excited about or reading, looking at their artwork, taking it in, talking to them. Because we had certain rules that if a child comes up and can't buy anything, you still need to be able to talk to them. They still need to be able to ask you questions and things. You can't just dismiss people. That's not what this con is about. And we had workshops where they could learn to draw their own characters. I had artists who volunteered to do these workshops. So it was more of a nurturing environment than a seller's market. But a lot of the guys there, they were just so thrilled, and they started saying, "You're going to do this again, right? You're going to do this again." I said, "Well, I hadn't planned to. I was just going to do it once, That was 16 years ago. And we've done one every year since, including 2 virtuals because of COVID, because of that incident that occurred in 2020.
In addition to all that, you have served on boards for several state organizations and for the Museum of Comics and Cartoon Art. What does serving on the board of an organization like that entail?
Well, there's the list of the things you're actually responsible for, and then there are the things that you actually do. To keep it short, I would say that when you're on a board for a not-for-profit, nonprofit organization, you're there for support, moral support, and collective administrative and creative support. You're also there to help generate interest in the organization and their activities. So whatever connections you have, whatever people you know that you can bring them to an event or make them aware of the events that you're doing, you're supposed to do that. And maybe get them to either donate money or donate time or donate objects or things like that, or maybe reach out to get media interested in certain events that you're doing. But your idea, your basic job as a board member is to support the organization and their good work. So for the organizations that I had been involved with, that was what I tried to do. You attend meetings, you attend the events, you do brain trust and try and work out things, and you try and draw attention to whatever good that they're doing. So for MoCA, the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art, when it existed, we had a number of exhibits and things that they did there, some really fantastic stuff in a small space that we had in Lower Manhattan. And two of the exhibits I was responsible for, one of them was a Tarzan exhibit of original art, and the other was supposedly the first, or certainly the first in many years, exhibit of Archie comics work and artwork, which was beautiful. It was so well put together. And I even got to dig in the vaults of Archie comics and pull out original pages that they had from like 30 years prior. And we had Victor Gorelick, who was the oldest editor on the planet at the time. He was still working for Archie. And he could see something that he hadn't looked at in 30, 40 years and go, oh yeah, so-and-so did that. I remember he brought it in the office on such a, so we had all these nice little signage cards that gave little tidbits of information. And it was really a great event. So part of that also is getting kids to be aware of it. A lot of what I have been involved in have been organizations, not-for-profit organizations, that deal with young people and children. So when I say young people, middle to teens, early 20s, or children, to give them support, to encourage them to imagine possibilities and to imagine their future and imagine what they might want to be when they grow up, and find things that support that and tell them that, yeah, that's your job. Your job is to envision all kinds of crazy possibilities and then shoot for it. And our job is to help you get there. And so that's a lot of what I was involved in with the New York State Alliance for Arts and Education, with MoCA, with the Department of Cultural Affairs. These are the things that I did over the years.
Well, is there anything that we haven't discussed that you would like to share with everybody?
Yeah, I've talked so much. I don't know. I would say, well, actually, two things. One is we didn't mention Raven League. How can I do that? Here, there we go.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay. This way. There we go. That's I did the Sherlock Holmes play, and that was about that was taking Sherlock Holmes, a character, fictional character, and putting him into a mystery adventure involving a real life person who existed back in the 1800s named Ira Aldridge, the black actor from the United States who went to England in the 1800s and became a continental theatrical celebrity during his time there, and married and had children there. And what happened to the family after he died is a real mystery. And so I sort of took all of that and wove it into a Sherlock Holmes play. And from doing that, I became very well known with the Sherlockians of the world, who then, over a period of time, because I had to deal with the Conan Doyle estate at the time, and so I again, you try and be professional, you try and be a good person and treat people right, and if you're lucky, you meet people of like minds, and so I did, and the Conan Doyle people liked what I did with the play. liked some of the other things that I was involved in with the Sherlockian organizations. And so when I came up with a young adult series called The Raven League, I wanted to pitch that. They gave me their blessing. They basically said, anything you want to do with Sherlock, we know you're going to do well, or you're going to do it well. And so The Raven League was a series that I did with Penguin Books. I did 2 books. There were some highs and lows with what happened with Barnes and Noble and marketing and everything, that the book didn't get a chance to really get out there the way it did. And I co-wrote those with my friend Bill McKay. So I'm looking to bring those back. And there's going to be some new Blackjack material that's coming out this fall. 2 new pieces, 2 new stories, and hopefully an audio play, which was, for those who are around my age, old radio play. So, and I'll keep you posted on those things. Other than that, I'm teaching at the New York Film Academy. I teach screenwriting there a few days out of the week. It's a part of my freelance experience. And I'm looking to continue to do that because it gives me an opportunity to work with students, young and old, from all over the world. I mean, literally. And that keeps me from becoming jaded, as folks will when we get to a certain age and we've sort of been running in the same, wheel of social experiences. We tend to think we know how everybody else is thinking. And this has kept me from going down that rabbit hole, both on a cultural level, but also, again, when you've earned these, you tend to make little remarks about, well, young people aren't what they were when I was. Well, we never were. We weren't what our parents were when they were our age, and grandparents and so on. I've been blessed to work with a number of young students who give me hope for the future on any continent, because they are good human beings. They are just as curious as I was when I was their age, and people before that. And a lot of them want to do good, and they want to recognize decency as a mantra rather than greed and corruption. And so I just think my job now, for whatever time I have left, is to continue to sort of support that and do everything I can to give them a leg up, so that when I pass the baton, there'll be hands to take it.
And where can people find information about your work and these projects that you mentioned?
My goodness, you don't think they've heard enough already? I would say that my website is probably one good place to go for that, which is simmonshereandnow.com. And then the other would be Instagram and Facebook. Instagram is weird. It's Simmons_Alexander, because Instagram wanted it that way. And on Facebook, I'm Alex Simmons.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining me today. And thanks to everyone who's watching. And just as a reminder, the Comics Lair is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and the Heroes Convention. For more information, visit www.heroesonline.com.